President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, I ask me to consider I be recognized as in morning business for such time as I shall consume.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I get it was Mark Twain might have characterized where we were just a short while ago as reports of the death of cap and trade have been greatly exaggerated. Now, it's true that we defeated all the bills. This was after the Kyoto Treaty was failed to even get recognized for discussion, leave alone ratified. And we had all the bills that were the Lieberman, the McCain-Lieberman bill, the Lieberman-Warner bill, the Markey bill, and all of these other bills, Waxman-Markey bill, and they're all killed. I mean, everyone knows that each year that went by, I can remember, Mr. President, way back 8 years ago, I was the only bad guy. I was the one that everybody hated, and that's when I made the statement, an honest statement at the time, that perhaps what they were trying to do with this global warming was the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people. Then, as time went by, more and more people, as the issue came up, agreed. And so a lot of things have happened. Just in the past year, we had the revelation of Climategate, which I will talk about in a minute. We had the failure in Copenhagen, the admission of the futility of unilateral climate action, the year of the skeptic, and vindication at the ballot box that took place on November the 2nd. And with all this, one might be tempted to declare victory, and I have to admit, for a short while I did. But after all, it was a year ago today that I gave a speech right here on the Senate floor at this very podium, noting that the tide had turned decisively against global warming alarmism. The year of the skeptic took place. That was a year ago. Now, just 2 days later, Climategate exploded into view as thousands of emails were released that showed, at a minimum, that they were very scientific spokesmen for alarmism, that they were scheming to block open and honest assessment of their work. And behind the veil of emails, they showed their true colors. They weren't acting as scientists, but as political hacks, promoting and defending a political agenda. Now, you might wonder what that agenda is. The agenda there would virtually shut down America. If you did away, a lot of people recognize that fossil fuels are necessary to run this machine called America. Right now, 53% of our energy is generated from coal. Coal is necessary. And we have clean coal technology, so the releases are much less than they used to be. And oil and gas, those are both fossil fuels. It's necessary, and the bottom line is you can't run this machine called America without that. Well, the damage has been done in terms of what was going on in Copenhagen, and so I think the chapter on the climate science has closed. Of course, Climategate scientists and their allies want to keep fighting. They're particularly begging us to bring them before committees to question their work, but we won't because they're now irrelevant. I mean, the time to talk about this science, particularly after Climategate, and the science is pretty much cooked. Now, I would say this, 5 years before Climategate, I gave a speech right here in the Senate and talked about what they were trying to do to cook science. Well, instead of talking about science, we talk about the economics of what's happening. Right now, we are talking about jobs, about competitiveness, the manufacturing and small businesses, and real people who will have to pay more for electricity, for food, for gasoline. And what do I mean? Well, even with all of the progress we've made, and while cap and trade is dead, bureaucratic cap and trade is alive and well. Now, what's happened in this country is that we have an administration with a majority in Congress. They tried to pass this legislatively. They tried to pass cap and trade. The cost of cap and trade, we finally were able to convince the American people that if you look at it, not from what Jim Inhofe says or Senator Inhofe says, but what the economists say, what they said MIT has stated, what the Wharton School said, that if you pass any of these cap and trade schemes, the cost to the American people would be in the range of $300 to $400 billion a year. Well, anyway, that's what they decided they weren't able to do legislatively. They thought, well, we'll just do this because we control the EPA. We'll do it through the regulations. So what Senator Reid said may be true for massive 1,000-page bills filled with mandates, taxes, regulations, bureaucracy, and much else, but it's not true for the more subtle strain of cap and trade now moving through the Environmental Protection Agency. That's right. This backdoor cap and trade hidden behind an administrative curtain. Now I can already hear what my friend, the EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson, will say. She will say, now, Senator Inhofe, you know we're regulating in broad daylight. We're inviting public comment. We're providing guidance. It's all above board. It's all out in the open. That may be true, and I trust Administrator Jackson, and she wants the EPA to be transparent. Unfortunately, this bureaucracy has gotten to the point where transparency is virtually impossible. The reality is backdoor cap and trade is hidden behind acronyms like PSD, BACT, SIPS, FIPS, and the like, and arcane legal provisions in the Clean Air Act. It's all a great muddle for bureaucrats and lawyers, but it's a profound disaster for jobs and for small businesses in America. But make no mistake, the intent's here, and ultimately the effect is no different than the Waxman-Markey, is to eliminate fossil fuels and impose centralized bureaucratic control over America's industrial manufacturing base. And unless we stop them, that is what they will achieve. Of course, President Obama will say that we could have avoided all of this if we just passed cap and trade, and that's true, we could have. But if we had done that, we also know that would not have preempted what the EPA would be doing. It's wrong on two counts. First, what kind of a deal involves accepting a really bad bill in place of really bad EPA regulations? That's no deal at all. Secondly, the supposed deal wasn't an either-or proposition. Waxman-Markey didn't fully eliminate EPA's ability to regulate under the Clean Air Act. President Obama and cap and trade supporters wanted both options, cap and trade, including regulation under the Clean Air Act. Now, keep in mind, all the time we're talking about something that is a very massive, it would be the largest single tax increase on the American people. You know, when you talk about $300 to $400 billion a year, you have to kind of bring that down. What does that mean to me? Well, I can tell you what it means to the taxpayers in my state of Oklahoma. Each taxpayer filing a tax return, it would mean over $3,000 a year. Now, what do you get for it? What you get for it is nothing, because one thing I like about Administrator Lisa Jackson, Administrator of the EPA, is she's honest in her answers. And I asked her the question, I said, you know, if we were to pass something like this, if we were to pass Waxman-Markey, do something legislatively, how would it affect worldwide emissions of CO2? And she said, well, it really wouldn't have much of an effect at all. Well, the reason is we can't do that here in the United States. This isn't where the problem is. The problem is in China, it's in India, it's in Mexico, it's other places around the world. And as we tighten up our availability of power, they have to go someplace, our manufacturing base, to find power. Well, now they would be going areas where they have less controls, and so that actually could very well have, by banning it here, would have an increase in the effect of emissions of CO2. I think most people understand that. Most people agree with that. But we have a long, difficult fight ahead. This fight goes back to December of '09, when EPA promulgated the endangerment finding, defining that CO2 endangers public health and welfare. We know what that finding is wrong, and we know it's based on flawed science. Let me explain. Before I went to Copenhagen last December, now, first of all, what Copenhagen was, that's the annual big party that the UN puts together. They've done it for 15 years now. Huge, huge party. They always have it in very exotic places. This next month it'll be held in Cancun. But last year, before I went to Copenhagen, I asked Administrator Jackson the very question, what is your endangerment finding? Actually, the way that happened, I say to you, Mr. President, was that we had a hearing. This is a public hearing, live on TV. Administrator Jackson was in our hearing room, and I said, well, I'm getting ready to leave tomorrow to go to be the one-man truth squad in Copenhagen. And I have a feeling when I leave, you're going to have an endangerment finding. What would that be based on? And the answer was the IPCC. Well, the IPCC, to make sure everybody understands, that's the United Nations. That's what started this whole thing way back in the 80s. And so now that that's established and we know the science on which an endangerment finding is based, we go to Copenhagen. It was just almost the next day that Climategate broke. And it's oddly enough, the timing couldn't have been better. I had nothing to do with it. I was as surprised as anyone. But they came out and they said that they talked about the flawed science that was there and the fact that they were cooking the science. And I have to say this, that 5 years ago this week, that was in 2005, I gave a speech on the Senate floor talking about how they are cooking the science at the United Nations, the IPCC, to make people believe that greenhouse gases, anthropogenic gases, CO2, methane, are causing catastrophic global warming. Now, that was their mission. They started out with that conclusion, then they tried to get science to support it. Well, all that was exposed. So the list of IPCC errors is so long that I won't repeat it here. I did so right after it came out. We already know, for example, that the claim that the Himalayan glaciers would melt by 2035 was off by about 300 years. What's important now is that the endangerment finding triggered regulations that will eventually reach out into every corner of the American economy. This will be the greatest bureaucratic intrusion into American life that we've ever seen. Let's put some specifics on that. We're talking about 6.1 million sources subject to EPA control and regulations. Now, EPA control and regulations, I don't think I have to tell you how onerous that would be, what that would be doing to all these institutions that would be affected. Now, the U.S. Chambers put together a list as to who would be affected by these new regulations that thousands and thousands and thousands of new bureaucrats would be crawling all over in America. 260,000 office buildings, 150,000 warehouses, 92,000 health care facilities, that's hospitals and so forth, 71,000 hotels and motels, 51,000 food service facilities, 37,000 churches and other places of worship, 17,000 farms. And now the EPA understands the political peril of regulating all these sources, so they decided to change the law without congressional authorization to exempt many of the sources I just mentioned. Now, that's a front. It sounds good. And they'll stand up and say, no, we're not talking about 250 tons of CO2. But the Clean Air Act specifically says that the major sources are that have a potential to emit 250 tons or more of given pollutants. All the farms, all the churches I just mentioned, they're going to be in that category. Now, 250 tons of, say, sulfur dioxide or nitrogen oxides is a good deal of pollution. But when it comes to CO2, it's not. Lots of facilities emit that amount and more. You're talking about schools, nursing homes, restaurants, people's individual residences, sources, mind you, that were never contemplated to be regulated when Congress passed the Clean Air Act. So what did EPA do? Well, they promulgated something called the tailoring rule. It gets kind of in the weeds here, but it's something that they created to say, well, no, we're not going to use 250 pounds of emissions. We're going to use 75,000 tons. Well, I'm sorry, 250 tons versus, instead it's 75,000 tons. Now, that means that we're talking about only the giants, the refineries and some of these groups. Well, the problem with that is that's not what the Clean Air Act says. Now, sources emitting above the amounts, those amounts have to get permits that require so-called best available control technology to reduce CO2. Of course, we don't know what that is. It's never been defined. The EPA issued draft guidance on what they call the BACT, that's the best available control technology, last week, but it provided no help. Just more confusion and uncertainty of what the requirements would be. And of course, they talk about that the EPA has a law in front of it. It says clearly that the major sources are those that have the potential to emit 250 tons or more. And it says the new number is 75,000 tons or more. So now the EPA can conveniently say that schools, hospitals, and the like won't be regulated, at least not until 2016. When the agency says it will consider whether to regulate such sources. And there's a catch. This supposed exemption through the tailoring rule only lasts for a few years, not to mention the fact that it blatantly violates the Clean Air Act, which subjects it to litigation. On that last point, the tailoring rule, along with the endangerment finding and other greenhouse gas rules, is being litigated, so we will know eventually whether the tailoring rule survives. I think it will be thrown out. But it really, just the fact that it can be thrown out should be enough for us to be honest with American people and say, we're going to regulate everything that falls within the 250 tons, all the residences and the churches and the farms and that I mentioned before. Again, I want everyone to understand the regulation of global warming by EPA, backdoor cap and trade, begins January 2nd. It's here, just a month away, and I'm not the only one who's concerned about it. On February 19, Senator Rockefeller, joined by 7 of his other Democrat colleagues, wrote Administrator Jackson, and he said, now keep in mind this is coming from the Democrats here in this chamber, quote, "We write with serious economic and energy security concerns relating the potential regulation of greenhouse gases from stationary sources under the Clean Air Act. We remain concerned about the possible impacts on American workers and businesses in a number of industrial sectors, along with the farmers, miners, and small business owners who could be affected as your agency moves beyond regulations for vehicle greenhouse gas emissions." So we need to address this because employers and small businesses are afraid to hire and expand right now, in large part because of the EPA's global warming regulations. They don't know what to expect. They're looking out there, they're looking at a Clean Air Act that has a very small threshold, and yet the statements that are being made that it's going to affect everyone, they don't know what to do. And I want my colleagues and the American people in general to know that EPA is moving in all directions beyond just implementing job-killing global warming regulations. EPA is threatening jobs on a host of fronts. A few months ago, I released an oversight report examining the thousands of jobs at risk. And by the way, this is a good report. It talks about 4 major areas of concern, and they are all on my website, inhofe.senate.gov. Look them up and you can read them if you want to be really scared. But the new standards for commercial industrial boilers, for example, is up to 798,000 jobs at risk. The revised National Ambient Air Quality Standards, that's ozone. That is going to be severe restrictions on job creation and business expansion in hundreds of countries nationwide, and new standards for Portland cement plants, up to 18% plants at risk, shutting down, threatening nearly 1,800 direct jobs and 9,000 indirect jobs. You know, I think we should be concerned enough about the unemployment rate that we have right now without exacerbating that problem, which is what we do with these rules. I think everyone knows that. Now, where are these rules going to hurt the most? In the heartland, and by that I mean Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, Wisconsin, Nebraska, Minnesota, and Montana. Of course, my own state of Oklahoma is feeling the brunt, and others will as well. Now, here's my bottom line. Backdoor cap and trade is alive and well. It's moving forward, and the fight over the future of Americans' industrial base is underway. I want to put the administration on friendly notice that I will investigate these rules vigorously in my capacity as a ranking member of the Environment and Public Works Committee. I do this to expose their impacts on jobs, energy prices, competitiveness, small businesses, energy security, and the true extent of their environmental benefits. It's my sincere hope that the EPA will pull back, revise, reform, and balance its regulatory agenda to protect jobs as well as the environment. If the EPA persists on moving down a more extreme path, then our 9.6 unemployment rate will be even worse in 2012. So in an attempt to stem the impending economic harm facing thousands of small businesses, the EPA has developed the so-called tailoring rule. And I don't want to elaborate on this. I would only say that the tailoring rule is to make people think that we're only going to be regulating those who emit 75,000 tons or more, when the law clearly says 250 tons or more. In some cases, these rules will have no meaningful environmental benefits. Considering the EPA's rules to regulate greenhouse gases, they would reduce global temperatures by 15/100ths of 1 degree by 2100. By the way, that same figure goes all the way back to the consideration of Kyoto. This is back in the 1990s. And I remember at that time, it was Vice President Al Gore's own scientists who, Tom Prigley, I believe his name was. And he came out and the question was, if all of the developed nations were to comply with Kyoto's emission requirements, how much would it reduce the temperatures by 50 years? And the answer was 7/100ths of 1 degree Celsius. And so all of this, you can talk about all this sacrifice we're making, nothing good can really come from it. So, I want to conclude, there are a lot of people here wanting to speak, but I would only say that if we, in the honesty of our administrator of the EPA, Lisa Jackson, when she talks about the fact that it really wouldn't make what we do unilaterally here in the United States is not going to have a major impact on emissions nationwide, and yet we know what it's going to cost. I just want to say we're going to quit talking about the science. We all understand now that science is not on their side, that the things that we said on the floor of the Senate 5 years ago were verified with Climategate. They've been cooking the science. It's very, very convenient. So lastly, I went to Copenhagen. I mentioned earlier that that's the big UN party each year. I went over there. Probably the most productive 2.5 hours of my life were the 2.5 hours I was on the ground in Copenhagen. I was preceded by Senator Kerry, Hillary Clinton, President Obama, and several others, Nancy Pelosi. And they were all assuring the other 191 countries present that we were going to do something about cap and trade. And I went there to make sure that they knew we were not. I always remember that because we had 400 people and 120 cameras who were zeroing in on me. And I say to my good friend from Virginia, they all had one thing in common. They all hated me. And so that is behind us now, and we have to now look at the regulators. This regulation would put America out of business. With that, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Virginia.
Madam President, before I get to my remarks, I want to commend my friend, the senator from Oklahoma, for his comments. I don't always agree with him, but I've had the opportunity to sit in that chair and listen to his views over the last 2 years, and let me make sure I make clear that that characterization of some of those folks with those cameras, I would not fall into that category, and I want to wish the senator a very happy birthday. My understanding it was yesterday, and I wish him all the best. Our offices are next door to each other, and we're good neighbors.